Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman. I've been reading my essay, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, Trapped in a Cultural Script. We're talking about a very dangerous fictional drama that's being promoted, that we're supposed to be believing in, that the crisis in Ukraine is about an innocent victim being attacked by an evil persecutor with rescuing heroes. These are the roles that are being advertised. But it's fictional because positive and negative motivations are on both sides of this conflict. And if you believe that it's a case just of good versus evil, then it's very dangerous, because those who believe they're good will feel justified when they inflict horrible hostility or even violence upon those who they think are evil. So this is the fourth video out of 6. The essay has 8 parts to it, and I'm on part 5 now. The entire essay is on countercurrents.org. So I'm going to be reading part 5. Part 5 is about U.S. greed and biases of the policymaker breed. Because with this script of good versus evil, in order to believe that Russia is evil, Russia's valid fears are dismissed as absurd. And therefore Americans think, oh, Russia's not acting out of fear, it must be acting out of malice and evil and aggression. And at the same time, to promote the script, for the U.S. to be painted as a heroic rescuer, U.S. greed is concealed, and also the biases and prejudices of the U.S. policymakers. So we're going to be talking about that part now, the great greed and biases that are being concealed from public view. The third step in the formula to secure belief in the script is to paint the U.S. as a heroic rescuer. Simple. Greed-related kleptocratic motives for antagonizing Russia are carefully and methodically ignored. Colossal profits made by U.S. weapon corporations and their high-salaried CEOs. NATO's agenda for naval bases, the Black Sea and beyond. IMF goals for austerity budgets so that Ukrainians can deprive themselves of money to pay back rich creditors. ExxonMobil's coveting massive Black Sea fossil fuel deposits. And Biden family connections with the board of Ukraine's largest private natural gas corporation, Burisma Holdings. Despite the highly suspicious nature of all of these factors, they're off the table for mainstream news discussion. Also hushed up are U.S. hopes to dominate the global energy trade, maintain the dollar as the international energy trade currency, retain all accompanying political benefits of dollar hegemony, including sanction power, displace Russia from Europe's gas market so Rockefeller can finally rest in peace, and shut down Nord Stream 2. And I refer to Rockefeller because in an earlier video I talked about how back in the 1880s, Rockefeller was trying to displace Russia from Europe's gas market. In fact, closing down Nord Stream 2 is cleverly framed as a punitive disciplinarian reaction to Russia's invasion, rather than an ulterior U.S. goal to drive Russia out of Europe's market. Lastly, the media ignores the unrelenting U.S. government business push to export unpopular fracked liquefied natural gas to Europe via Ukraine. Although former U.S. Secretary of Energy and former Texas Governor Rick Perry had been eagerly pushing to sell fracked LNG to Zelensky to help out the companies of friends and political donors in Texas and Louisiana, the issue of sending LNG to Europe is framed, naturally, as a rescue mission, to rescue innocent Europe from evil Russia, not a Texan profit-making bonanza at all. LNG companies are excited that the U.S. has become the world's largest exporter of LNG, a product once spurned by Europe because of its methane-leaking properties, but now eagerly consumed, thanks to propelling Russia out of the European market. But again, not one speck of greed or acquisitiveness can be displayed, or it would detract from the rescuing hero image. To believe in the script as truth, and really see the U.S. as a noble hero, we've also got to ignore the biases and aims of groups such as the Alliance for Securing Democracy, ASD, Albright Stonebridge Group, ASG, which has Russian business acquisition interests, and the Center for a New American Security, CNAS. ASD, Alliance for Securing Democracy, an initiative of the German Marshall Fund of the U.S., has the precise mission of opposing and defeating Russia's President Vladimir Putin, supposedly for being an authoritarian, aggressively seeking to oppose democracy. One wonders whether these business-oriented Americans are actually more angered over Putin's renationalization of parts of the Russian economy, including the banking and energy sectors, and their possibly reduced access to Russian markets under his leadership. In contrast to the time following the USSR's dissolution in 1991 under President Boris Yeltsin, when Russians and Americans were making windfalls at the expense of the Russian people who fell into poverty. On the advisory board of ASD are people with a certain frame of mind, found only amongst certain Americans who are unrepresentative of the American population, or at least unrepresentative of the unindoctrinated American mind. It's worth examining these individuals because their minds are a big reason why the U.S. is responding to the current conflict the way it is. Advisors include a mix of neoconservatives and liberal hawks, a marriage that transpired during the Trump administration when neoconservatives left the Republican Party and joined ranks with Hillary Clinton. It was probably an easy marriage. After all, they seemed to agree about the importance of using government to intervene abroad in order to make money for corporations, which they apparently mistake for the concept of democracy. Advisors include William Kristol, co-founder of the now-defunct neoconservative Project for the New American Century, PNAC, infamous for its unequivocal goals of enlarging the military budget to achieve great conquests abroad and to be capable of fighting in 2 theaters of war at once, as proclaimed shamelessly in Rebuilding America's Defenses, written in 2000. And you can bet they imagine themselves as rescuing heroes in those theaters. ASD advisors also include Mike Chertoff, co-author of the infamous U.S. Patriot Act and former Secretary of Homeland Security, as well as Michael Morrell, former Deputy Director of the CIA and a defender of drone warfare, who has been called a torture apologist with regard to the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques. In an absurd claim, Morrell stated that Russia's alleged attempt to use social media to influence Americans in U.S. elections was the political equivalent of 9/11. One can only wonder what could be the political equivalent of the CIA's enormous psychological and propaganda efforts to wildly interfere in political elections abroad, as documented in works such as William Bloom's Killing Hope. And what is the political equivalent of the U.S. government's multiple coups since at least 1953, when the CIA, with the assistance of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., toppled Iran's popular Mohammad Mossadegh, killing 500 Iranians in the process? The CIA, along with the Agency for International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, have grossly and illegally interfered in the affairs of foreign nations and subverted foreign societies through coups and pre-coup planting of false propaganda, riot instigation, character assassination, bribery, campaign funding, and economic sabotage. The CIA has agents or ownership of media outlets worldwide. It's created fake left-wing organizations abroad to attract people's energy, time, and money away from real left-wing organizations aiming for reform. All of these operations interfere grossly with the freedom, wealth, and political sovereignty of foreign nations and their populations. Why so much fuss about the alleged Russian interference when there are no public hearings or charges for decades of U.S. interference in multiple nations abroad? And I'm sure the U.S. is aiming at economic sabotage right now of Russia in order to help with the coup against Putin. Getting back to ASD, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, also serving on its board, or at least said to be serving in 2017 when it was founded, are Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, whose statements in a 2019 interview about the special qualities of Americans indicate he's a supporter of U.S. exceptionalism and intervention, even though he feels he's being modest by recognizing U.S. flaws. Sullivan, who also served under Biden in the Obama administration during the 2014 coup, seems to excuse American intervention and mistakes abroad because at least Americans have positive aspirations, a characteristic he strangely finds unique to Americans. Of course, as the title of Bloom's book suggests, Killing Hope, probably many people worldwide have lost hope and aspirations because so many promising leaders are gunned down by the CIA, and all conflicts are escalated by U.S. weapons delivered to the scene. However, even if Americans have positive aspirations and no one else does anymore, one would think that good intentions aren't good enough in foreign policy. A nation that makes so many lethal mistakes should be humble enough to learn to keep its hands to itself and not meddle in other nations. Another mystery is Sullivan's claim that the U.S. is uniquely a land of problem solvers. How is this possible? Is he ignoring the destruction the U.S. has wreaked upon so many nations in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America? Most Americans can't even speak another language. Craig Whitlock's The Afghanistan Papers reveals that U.S. policymakers didn't know what they were doing for 20 years in Afghanistan. But we're to believe Americans can help foreigners solve problems? Sullivan also makes the ludicrous claim, despite every conflict in which it has engaged, that the U.S. does not believe in zero-sum conflicts where one nation can gain only at the expense of the other. So should the U.S. return the American Southwest to Mexico to prove that the U.S. didn't gain at Mexico's loss? Should the U.S. try not to steer Russia out of Europe's gas market so that U.S. companies won't win at Russia's expense? Should the U.S. stop committing coups so that their favorite leader doesn't win at the expense of another? According to Sullivan, the United States supposedly doesn't believe that a dog-eat-dog world's okay as long as you're the biggest dog. Yet the U.S. has been bossing the world around precisely because it is the biggest dog with the biggest military, with dollar hegemony, and with the greatest power at the IMF and World Bank. Why else would it refuse to join the International Criminal Court unless it receives veto power? Why else did it create the rule so that it's the only nation with veto power at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank? It wants to be the biggest dog with the most power. Sullivan even feels Americans are special because of our beliefs in human rights and feelings of interconnectedness. How on earth can he make this claim about a nation that shows an absence of empathy for anyone but itself and, of course, victims of Russian violence, and destroys all human rights with its invasions, torture, detentions, kidnappings, and drone-style executions? The U.S. war on terror has killed more than 800,000 Mideasterners. How does this demonstrate one speck of feeling interconnectedness, one whit of respect for human rights? Has Sullivan even conversed with Iraqi and Afghan survivors of the U.S. invasions and torture prisons? In listening to Sullivan's claims about the U.S., his words offer a clue into the mindset of these policymakers. Either they're lying through their teeth, or there's an alarming disconnect between what they're thinking and what they're doing. Their words don't match reality. They're absolutely blind to the horrors they're inflicting. Now, when I read Sullivan's interview, he sounds like a nice guy, what he's saying. But the thing is, this isn't true. I don't know if he believes it or not. It is extremely dangerous that U.S. policymakers create colossal amounts of violence, despair, and destruction abroad, yet remain convinced that they should continue to interfere abroad because of their alleged but missing in action problem-solving skills, benevolence, fairness towards little dogs, respect for human rights, interconnectedness, and positive aspirations. Are State Department and Defense Department policymakers just looking for something to fill their time and justify their organization's existence and personal paychecks, and so they become great busybodies abroad? It would be helpful for these policymakers to get in discussion with other types of people so that they could break through the weakness of their insularity, gain insight from other people's various strengths, and totally revamp their organizational missions. And I don't mention this in the essay, but in my unpublished works, that's a big problem is that U.S. foreign policy is just harnessed by the missions of the U.S. Department of Defense and the Department of State, which is really like a Department of Defense but without weapons, and the CIA, National Security Agency. You know, the Department of Defense, CIA, their missions are okay for them. I mean, they're doing their job. But the thing is, foreign policy shouldn't be driven by their missions. That's, you know, looking out for spies and looking out for danger and being prepared for an enemy attack. That's important, but that shouldn't be the driving force of U.S. foreign policy. That's why we should have a U.S. Department of Peace, as former U.S. Congressman Dennis Kucinich proposed multiple times. They need to totally revamp their organizational missions. Otherwise, the nation and world would be better off if these people received their paychecks and sat at their desks doing nothing than to continue doing what they're doing now. The third organization mentioned above is the Center for a New American Security. Very similar sounding to Project for a New American Security, or New American Century. But Center for a New American Security, which was formerly led by President Biden's Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, who also has advised Albright Stonebridge Group, and who is now Biden's Undersecretary of State. She's now Biden's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Nuland's husband is Robert Kagan, the other co-founder of the similarly sounding neoconservative Project for a New American Century, PNAC. Nuland is infamous for the leaked tape from 2014 in which she and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, appear to be deciding who should become the new leader of Ukraine. What's interesting is that this conversation takes place even before Yanukovych is ousted, which suggests that they know he's going to be ousted. The confidence with which these two Americans appear to be selecting a leader for the Ukrainian population is both arrogant and undemocratic. And it suggests that they not only are choosing Ukraine's next leader, but they're perhaps playing a role in getting rid of Yanukovych. From what I've read of the tape's excerpts, none of this is proven by the tape, from what I've read. But the CIA and NED, National Endowment for Democracy in quotes, do have a lengthy history of doing this very thing, arousing protests that lead to violence and then a coup, and along with the economic sabotage. It's a familiar pattern. It's the signature trademark of U.S. foreign policy. Unfortunately, this is probably how certain Americans decide for the rest of us in our democratic nation, who the top candidates of the two twin dominant parties will be. It might as well have been the same person ruling our country for 200 years. The policies don't significantly change. What's the big deal about having presidential and congressional term limits when the same ideology, that government exists to serve the wallets of certain social and business circles, that enemies are to be confronted with weapons, turns out year after year? At any rate, Russia was suspected of recording and leaking the Nuland tape, and instead of convicting, criticizing, or even questioning U.S. policymakers for their potentially illegal, undemocratic interference in Ukraine's internal political affairs, it was Russia that was blamed and accused of sinking to a new low for having released the tape and exposed U.S. crimes. So it's not the crime that's the crime, it's exposing the crime that's the crime. But then there's this falseness going on in public statements to the American public. On Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman quotes President Barack Obama stating, quote, "Our approach as the United States is not to see these as some Cold War chessboard in which we're in competition with Russia. Our goal is to make sure that the people of Ukraine are able to make decisions for themselves about their future, without having bombs going off, or towns being starved, because a despot wants to cling to power." It's a nice statement. But like Sullivan's ideas, there's a disconnect between what's being said and what's being done. A coup, especially a U.S.-supported coup. But even a non-U.S.-supported coup that's powered by extreme right-wing violence, as the 2014 coup was, is not the equivalent of the entire Ukrainian population having a voice in making the decisions. The Ukrainian population includes left-wingers, right-wingers, the apolitical, large populations of both ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians, the poor, middle class, wealthy, and the corrupt. Whether you're Obama, Biden, or Putin, you can't support only a part of this and say you're supporting all Ukrainians' right to decide their future. Moreover, unlike what Obama says, the U.S. is in direct competition with Russia over Ukraine, politically, economically, and militarily. The U.S. government doesn't want to make it look that way because then it doesn't seem so heroic. It seems more like a selfish power that's opportunistically supporting those Ukrainians, likely those corrupt Ukrainians, who help special U.S. business and social circles. Instead, the U.S. wants to make it look like it's standing up for the right of the people of Ukraine to enjoy democracy and decide their future for themselves. But Putin says the exact same thing, that the Ukrainian people should decide for themselves. Only when he says it, U.S. policymakers and media makers either ignore it or deny his honesty. And when Obama says it, we're supposed to trust his words, even though he seems to have supported a coup of a democratically elected leader. Even though Nuland and Pyatt seem to be picking Ukraine's next leader, and even though the U.S. and NATO are arming one side of the conflict with billions in weapons. How can arming one side of a conflict in a Ukrainian civil war be representative of all Ukrainians? U.S. policymakers claim that those fighting in Donetsk and Luhansk are not really Ukrainians. They're Russian props. They're unrepresentative. They're rotten people. The evil persecutor. But this is false. A large portion of those living in these two republics would rather be a part of Russia. Yanukovych himself, the ousted president, is from Donetsk. Another large portion would just as soon be with Ukraine. Probably nearly all of them don't think the matter is important enough to warrant violence, which includes not only the Russian invasion, but the U.S. and NATO's shipments of billions of dollars in weapons since 2014. And this giant group, the ones who probably don't think it's worth violence, is the group that repeatedly lacks a voice in war and in the barbaric, profit-motivated U.S. policies of weapons shipments. Nuland's group, CNAS, is funded by a variety of donors, but mainly by weapon corporations, including Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Honeywell International, Raytheon, BAE, Boeing, General Atomic CEO, as well as the U.S. Department of Defense, the European Union, ExxonMobil, Visa, and the defense ministries of Estonia, Norway, Finland, and the UK. It's also funded by high-tech companies such as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Intel. Silicon Valley companies have become increasingly involved with the Defense Department's use of artificial intelligence and image recognition in drone warfare. The death out of the blue warfare that has deprived certain nations of peace of mind forever. So in other words, the woman that was CEO of an organization highly sensitive to the goals of weapon corporations, the Defense Department, and ExxonMobil, is now directing foreign policy, particularly in Ukraine. But we, of course, are either to assume that her judgment is not swayed by those interests, or we're to assume that it's only right for foreign policy to be swayed by those interests. Above all, we're not supposed to wonder whether anything might be wrong in allowing those interests to shape foreign policy. In fact, many of Biden's administration members belong to ASD, ASG, and CNAS. Those three groups I mentioned. And the severe problem is that these people all seem to be of the same breed. It's not that this breed is inferior or superior, so my comment is not meant to sound cruel. But the problem is, their minds are like one. What exactly is the benefit of democracy if only certain mentalities are allowed to rule? If you have only one mind ruling democracy, how is that democratic? With identical minds and vision come identical blind spots, similar strengths and similar weaknesses. The astonishing degree of insularity within the breed has been a problem with U.S. foreign policymakers for more than a century, with U.S. presidents and numerous high officials typically closely connected with either the Rockefeller or the Morgan family of interests or both. When you go back and look at this, it's shocking. Administration after administration, they're all connected to Rockefeller, Morgan, with investment companies, banks, lawyers. It's the same people, the same circles, and then their families. All the same mind, the same values, the same priorities, and the same blind spots. In fact, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and J.P. Morgan Chase & Company are also major donors to CNAS. The social mental, quote, inbreeding of sorts is made even worse by the revolving door between government, corporations, banks, law firms, consulting firms, and the military. Policymakers likely believe that the various interests are dovetailing splendidly with foreign policy and business interests working well together. But actually, government policy is submerged and distorted in order to serve the biases and financial interests of these social circles. It's not a dovetailing of interests. The government policy is submerged and distorted to their interests. I don't think that they may not even realize it. Without this lethal submersion, powered by money-oriented and control-oriented minds, it's likely that we could have experienced U.S. foreign policy that was actually peaceful and just. Instead, the U.S. Department of State is merely a non-weaponized form of the U.S. Department of Defense. If you look at the Department of State's website, it's shocking to see that the Department's mission and all its bureau's missions are essentially to convince foreigners to like, support, and serve U.S. interests, which of course means the interests only of those very special social and business circles on top. But what's disturbing is that the State Department mission is not to increase understanding of foreigners' perspectives in order to be better friends, in order to create policies that are kinder and more helpful to them, and in order to prevent conflict. The mission is to get others to understand and support the U.S. It's like a giant cult. No wonder Americans aren't encouraged to study, let alone master, many or any foreign languages, unless it's to be a spy. It's everyone else who's expected to learn English. After all, Americans don't really need to know what anyone else is saying. It's the others who have to listen and obey U.S. officials. No wonder U.S. diplomats think of diplomacy not as the development of mutual empathy, understanding, cooperation, and integrative negotiation, but as gaining leverage over others. They always use that word, leverage. Killing and bombing foreigners to make them acquiesce, using power-based negotiation of intimidation and economic and physical threats, and applying pressured forms of elbow twisting and bribes. To me, that's not negotiation. It's disgusting. I'd hate to grow up in a household like that, where the kids just have to shut up, listen to what they're told, and obey. To think when I was little, I thought a diplomat was a wonderful, caring person who created harmony based on mutual understanding and genuine caring. I think we should stop the planet so that many of us can disembark and go our own way. It's too upsetting to even think about. And the U.S. is supposed to be so smart, a superpower. It's disappointing. Again, it is important to get different types into policy making, or at least for policymakers to have discussions with a wider variety of people. Because if you're outside that foreign policy making establishment, it's quite obvious how obsessive, narrow, and misguided they are in their addiction to a certain hostile, control-oriented approach to human and international relations. The characteristics of the U.S. foreign policy maker circle have been the same for a few centuries: considering enemies to be worthy of death, having below average levels of empathy in comprehending enemies' perspectives, below average levels and abilities to conduct cooperative, egalitarian negotiations as opposed to top-down, hierarchical negotiations, below average levels and abilities to communicate with so-called enemies, enthusiasm for developing and selling weapons, enthusiasm for inflicting punishment and threats as the primary means of controlling so-called enemies, and enthusiasm for applying pressured forms of diplomacy or violence to gain profits from foreign resources, labor, and markets to benefit those certain special U.S. social and business circles who just so happen to control our foreign policy. Besides weapon-oriented, control-oriented, money-oriented, and high society-oriented biases, ethnic biases also probably exist within the administration, considering the Ukrainian Jewish background of Nuland, the Lithuanian Jewish background of her husband, Kagan, even though he's not directly in the administration, and the Polish background of Brzezinski's son, who was Biden's ambassador to Poland. The danger with all this is that these ethnic biases could prevent us from ever understanding Russia's point of view. And all of these biases could prevent us from ever understanding Russia's point of view. This concludes part 4 of 6 of the essay that I wrote, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, Trapped in a Cultural Script. And I'm Kristen Chrisman, and I'll continue with 2 more videos to complete the essay, which is also located on countercurrents.org. Thank you very, very much for listening.